The first time Ishara Vale touched the corrugated skin of the hangar, wind rippled through the torn roof like breath through a harmonica. The sheets sang a tired, metallic hymn, and the sound climbed her bones, familiar as the hum of a socket wrench. She stood alone on the cracked tarmac of Bighorn County Airfield, with dust in her teeth, a paper deed in her pocket, and half the town's laughter still clinging to her jacket like burrs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. She pinched the bridge of her nose and let her breath settle. The old hangar, number 9, faded white digits slouched over the door, smelled like sun-baked avgas and mice. Out here, the Wyoming sky felt bigger than any roof, and even the shadows had a dry, thirsty look. Ishara slipped off her gloves, palm lines dark with grit, and pressed her bare hand to the steel. You and me, we're going to make them eat their words. Someone whistled. The sound cut across the runway and snagged. Cam Sutter leaned against his lifted pickup near the fence line, arms brown and folded. He wore the kind of smirk men put on when they've decided a woman is funny for trying. "Vale, you buy the roof or just the holes?" A couple of mechanics from Sutter Auto laughed, boots up on the tailgate, chewing toothpicks like the world was salt. Ishara checked the padlock on Hangar 9, her lock now, turned the numbers and swung the door. It complained loud and long, as if it hadn't been asked for honesty in years. Sunlight poured in and exposed everything: a collapsed workbench, an airplane jack seized with rust, a film of dust so thick that when she stepped inside, it rose like breath from a sleeping thing. Sutter's boots climbed the fence one rung, then another. "Aren't you supposed to buy cars you can fix, not buildings you'll die under?" "Supposed to," she said, and found a broom in the corner with bristles like exploded hay. "You think? You come to tell me what I'm supposed to do?" "Came to see the show. Whole town's been bored since calving season. Figured this'd be comedy." She didn't look up from sweeping. You learn things running a shop in a town that thinks you're a novelty. Which laughter bounces and which cuts deep, which men perform cruelty for an audience, and which carry it like pocket change. She'd chosen this airfield because it had one runway, 2 tumbleweeds for company, and a history nobody visited anymore. Perfect for a woman who needed a quiet place for loud work. "This a date setter?" she asked, voice mild. "You bring me flowers?" "Only thing growing here is tetanus." He grinned wider, the kind that required teeth. "You gonna fix this barn with Instagram?" She stood the broom in the corner and turned to face him, the light behind her knifing dust into gold. "I'm gonna fix it with a crowbar and a stubborn streak. You planning to help or just keep educating me?" He opened his mouth, then shut it. The wind got a word in, carrying the thin whistle of the gate as it scraped, the distant rattle of prairie. Ishara held his gaze a beat longer than most people found comfortable. He blinked first. "See you around," he muttered, dropping back to his side of the fence like a boy caught peeking through a keyhole. The tailgate laughter retreated with him, tires crunching gravel, the show packed up for another day. She turned back to the hangar and studied its bones. A place always tells you what it's for if you listen close enough. Hangar 9 said, "I have seen wings sleep. I have seen men cry into their sleeves. I have held engines still warm from heaven." She listened, then got to work. The plan was simple in a way that scared people who prefer complications to courage. She would salvage the trusses, replace the purlins, sister the rotted studs, lay new corrugated roof, wire proper 220 out to the main panel, pour a level pad, install a chain hoist, reskin the sidewalls, and build a shop that could do what her cramped 2-bay downtown could not: heavy teardown, fabric work, prop balancing, maybe even a full airframe restoration if the wind stayed friendly and the bank didn't change its mind about the line of credit. The bank manager, a careful woman named Dawn, with hair like polished wheat, had tilted her head when she asked, "You really intend to take on an aircraft hangar?" "No, I intend to take on a reputation." Now, on the first afternoon, she pried nails as old as the county from pine, each one an eyelash of iron. A teenage boy appeared at the door just as she freed a stubborn spike. His shadow stretched across the concrete, long and uncertain. "Miss Vale?" She turned. He had a summer's worth of freckles and the kind of shoulders that hadn't yet decided whether to be broad. A bicycle helmet dangled from one hand. "You're Davy's kid, from the feed store." "Arjun. Dad said if I was going to moon over airplanes, I should at least shut up and help someone who knows machines." Ishara nodded towards a pry bar as tall as his hip. "You ever use one of those?" "Yes, ma'am," he lied.
"Good," she said, and handed him a pair of gloves. "You're about to get better." They worked until the light went syrupy, lifting out rotten decking, stacking salvage, filling a contractor bag with squirrel nests that looked like they'd been knit by lunatics. Arjun talked the way boys do when they're seeing themselves reflected in a new surface. A little louder than necessary, a little faster than sense. He knew the names of airplanes the way farm kids know the rain. Tiger Moth, Stearman, Mustang. He peppered her with questions about magnetos and control surfaces. And when she showed him a flap hinge, he touched it the way some boys touch the sleeve of a girl they've decided to love in secret. "Why'd you buy it?" he asked, wiping his face with the back of his forearm, leaving a clean streak like a comet's tail. "Because it was cheaper than the sky," she said. When he frowned, she added, "Because once you have a roof this size and doors this wide, nobody can tell you to stop in the middle." He considered that. "My dad says the county only put Hangar 9 on the auction block because it's falling down. He says you'll get stuck and the bank will take your—" "My what?" she prompted when he choked. "Your shop," he finished, cringing. She let him feel the awkwardness for exactly 2 heartbeats, then rescued him. Dads say things because they love their kids and have seen how the world behaves when it thinks it won't be contradicted. Tell your dad he can be right about most things and wrong about me. He grinned. "Yes, ma'am." An old Cessna wheeled overhead, engine a bee and honey, and Arjun tilted his face to watch it trace the edge of the town's afternoon. "One day," he said, so softly she almost didn't hear, "I'm going to fly out of here without coming back." Ishara glanced at him, then at the hangar's rib cage cutting the light into stripes. "If you do it because you want the horizon, not because you hate the place you're standing." He nodded as if she'd given him a tool he couldn't name yet. They worked another hour and then she sent him home with a sandwich and a promise. Tomorrow, he could run the Sawzall. He pedaled away like a launched kite. The second day, the county inspector came with a clipboard and a pen that clicked like a metronome for impatience. His name was Leland Finch, and he wore aftershave so old-fashioned it had a memory. "Miss Vale," he said, drawing out the V like he was setting a bone. "I hear congratulations are in order. Heard you bought this—" he squinted up at the roof. "Heritage item." "I prefer opportunity," she said. "Opportunity is what folks call sinkholes before their neighbors fall in." He peered over his glasses at the electrical panel. "This is dinosaur. It's pre-dinosaur. Trilobite electrical. I'll rerun it. Or you could accept that some buildings are past saving and you have a perfectly good shop downtown." "That shop can't hold a wing," she said. "This can, eventually." "You're going to bring jets to Bighorn County?" He grinned at his own joke, a grin that had watched too many women walk away from counters without a receipt because they'd given up arguing. "I'm going to bring work," she said. "Work that pays taxes and buys sandwiches. Work that keeps your nephews from having to leave for Casper. Work that makes the county look like it can marry past and future without filing a restraining order."
Leland's eyes flicked, involuntary, toward the empty runway where the heat wobbled like a mirage. Then he scowled because that was the face he trusted. "Your permit application is missing Form B for structural reassessment. It's on your desk," she said.
"It is," he acknowledged reluctantly, "but I needed you to know it was missing." "Now I know," she said, amused. "Want coffee?" He hesitated, then shook his head as if accepting kindness might be a conflict of interest. "Don't get yourself killed under that roof." "I won't," she said. "I've got a standing argument with gravity. I tend to win." When he left, Cam returned, this time with a taller man in a crisp shirt, the airport commissioner, Saul Byrne. Byrne's hair was silver, the way winter fences are silver, and his handshake was as dry as the runway. He took in the hangar, Ishara's toolbox, the layout of her extension cords, the careful order in the midst of collapse. "You're serious," he said, like a doctor who has decided not to laugh at an improbable diagnosis. "Wrong town to fake it," she said. "The county could have given you a better hangar," Cam offered, almost helpful, "one with a roof." "They could have given me a parade, too," she said. "But then where would I put the tinsel?" Byrne's mouth did something like a smile. "What's the end game?" "An airframe I can put my name on. A line of old birds that can leave here prettier than they arrived. A place where the past isn't a prop." He looked past her, deeper into the gloom, where a row of lockers stood against the back wall, doors ajar, mouths exactly at the height of a man's ribs. "Those haven't been opened since the 70s. Belonged to the Civil Air Patrol when we still had enough volunteers to fill a room." Ishara tilted her head. "Do you have the combination?" "Probably the same one they used for everything back then. Birth year of the county's oldest living veteran." He glanced at Cam. "Go on. Ask Delaney at the Legion. He'll tell you." "Why?" Cam asked, suspicious of any errand that might count as help. "Because if she's trying to build history out of scrap, she deserves whatever ghosts are willing to come quietly." Cam left with a look that said he'd never forgive Byrne for making him a courier. When he returned an hour later, he tossed a crumpled napkin at Ishara. "Delaney says it's 1921. Says if you ruin something, he'll haunt you and eat all your soup." "Tell Delaney he's welcome to my soup," she said, and spun the dial. The locker door swung open with a hiss of old paint. Inside, a uniform jacket hung like a memory kept too long on a hanger. The air had a different kind of dust, finer, almost sweet, like old paper argues with time and loses politely. Behind the jacket, on the top shelf, rested a battered tin box the color of battleships. Someone had stenciled letters on the lid in a hand that liked straight lines. G. Parish. Byrne stepped closer. "General Gideon Parish, Air Mobility Command, retired to a ranch west of here. He used to fly in with a bull terrier with a name longer than mine. He died last winter, left his land to a conservancy, gun salute and everything. My uncle did the honor guard. Said the general didn't flinch once at his own thunder." Ishara ran a finger over the stencil. The lid lifted stiffly, as if it had been waiting for a password. Inside were two things: a folded American flag, no longer crisp enough to cut paper, and a thick envelope sealed with red wax impressed with a crest, a compass rose with its north worn smooth. The envelope bore a single line, in a hand that threads the needle between authoritative and human: "For the woman who will bring the hangar back to honor." The room tilted. Not in her body, she was steady as rebar, but in the story she'd been writing by force. For the woman. She didn't know the general. He died before her lease on Earth and this county, and yet here was his script already written to include her, the ink long dry. "What does it say?" Cam asked, careful to sound like he didn't care. "Not for you," Ishara said, careful to sound like she wasn't shaken. She closed the lid and set the box on the bench like you set down a sleeping child, slow enough not to wake anything, firm enough to say, "I'm not afraid. I'll open it later, when I'm not covered in roof." Cam rolled his eyes skyward. Of course. Word about the envelope traveled faster than wind. By supper, half the diner had an opinion about who a dead general could possibly mean by the woman. By closing time, every opinion had fermented into certainty. By morning, there were two women standing by her hangar with coffee cups and hats, faces unkindly eager.
"You going to open it right there?" asked May Hardy, who had once told Ishara she liked her pluck and then ordered a man to do the welding because pluck can't read volts. "No," Ishara said, brushing sawdust from her hair. I'm going to open it when I can hear it. May squinted. It's paper. It doesn't talk. Everything talks if you shut up enough, Ishara said, too tired for diplomacy. She was building walls in wind that wanted to unbuild them. Byrne had found a crew of volunteers from the high school shop class, and they came with embarrassment and hunger and hands ready to learn. Ishara paid them in pizza and respect and taught them what torque feels like when it tells the truth. They learned she never raised her voice to be heard over noise. She waited for quiet to arrive and then said the one thing that made you want to pick up another nail. She rebuilt the west door track with Arjun's help, calibrating patience to a boy's attention as carefully as alignment. She measured twice and cut once, then cut again because boards and days warp. She filed off burrs with the kind of care that has grief inside it. Every piece that would never be seen mattered because trust is built where light cannot go. On the 6th day, the wind died at noon as if a god had lifted a hand. The air lay down. In the new silence, she brought the tin box to the workbench and wiped her palms on her jeans. The teenagers cleaned up without being asked, instinctively making space around significance. Cam stood farther back than curiosity wanted, as if he understood that proximity could be mistaken for claim. Byrne removed his hat. Ishara broke the wax with a thumbnail. The sound was small, like a door on a dollhouse. She unfolded the letter. The paper had gone the color of tea left too long in sun, but the ink held like a pinion. Miss Vale. Her mouth went dry. Not "to whom it concern" or "dear future caretaker." He'd written to her as if he knew the name of the woman who'd stand where she stood, dust and daylight in equal measure on her eyelashes. I don't know when you are reading this, or what the county had to do to make you inherit the bones of a building no one else wanted. I know only this. The wind out here will cut you and make you clean, and your hands are already the right kind of stubborn. I flew through this door when I still believed a runway was a promise. I parked here when I learned a runway is a question. I am leaving you 3 things that do not rust: a reason, a map, and a debt that is not burden but bridge. The reason is simple. Honor wears out slower than metal if you keep using it. The map you will find where the compass rose points when you lay this letter against the floor of the office. The debt will come find you on 2 legs and too much pride. His name is Saul Byrne. You will know what to do with him. I have outlived too many letters and not enough mornings, but I promised a man I trusted that this place would be held in hands that would go ungloved when it matters. If they laugh, let them. Laughter is what people make when fear kicks the table. Where I am going, they cannot follow, and where you are going, they can only follow if they learn. When the moment comes, and it will, open Bay 2. Do not hesitate. Tenny. Gideon Parrish, General, retired. Ishara read it again, then a 3rd time, as if there were a 4th thing between the lines she might miss if she blinked. The map. The map did not live on paper. It lived in placement. The office still had its cracked vinyl tiles, a dozen missing, a dozen pretending they weren't. In the corner, a compass rose had been painted long enough ago that the north point was a ghost. Lay it down, Byrne said, voice low, reverent. He was suddenly a different man, not the commissioner with worry in his pen, but the boy he had once been with a kite in wind that frightened him and feet that refused to let go. Ishara knelt, knees popping, and set the letter so its compass lined with the floor's old star. The north of letter and floor met like palms, lifeline to lifeline. Where the letter's west arm pointed, there was a tile with a hairline crack. She looked up at Byrne. He was already moving. Cam found a putty knife and a pry bar and offered them without comment. Arjun held his breath like a diver. The tile came up with reluctance, then surrender. Beneath lay concrete, then a cut, a saw line. Someone had poured a secret and finished it smooth and hoped time would sand off curiosity. It hadn't. We'll need a hammer drill,
Ishara said. I have one, Cam said. On the truck. She met his eyes. He shrugged as if to say, I came to watch you fail and found a story. She nodded once, at acknowledgement of a treaty not yet signed, and he jogged out, returned with the drill, set the bit, and handed her the handle without theater. Concrete dust rose like a blessing no one ordered. They cut a square the size of a bread loaf. Argent slid his fingers into one edge and levered, face nodding. Byrne and Cam caught the other side. The slab lifted, and there was the box. Military green, waterproof seal, weighty. Inside, a leather logbook, neat numbers marching their columns. A metal tag stamped with an aircraft serial number, a photograph of a woman in coveralls leaning against a tailwheel, smile crooked as a paperclip, and a second envelope, smaller, unsealed. Ishara lifted the photograph with both hands. The woman had hair twisted up like it meant business and eyes that didn't blink for anyone. On the back, written in the same hand as the letter, my crew chief. When men said no, she said, try the other wrench. If you are the one who finds this, you are her kin, whether or not there's blood to prove it. The smaller envelope held a certificate deeded in the name of the parish wing, an endowment set up through the General's Trust, funds released for the restoration of aircraft or aircraft spaces at Hangar 9, contingent upon the agreement of the Bighorn County Airport Commission. There was a signature line for the commission chair. Below it, years old but untouched by pen, Saul Byrne. Everyone in the room read it at speed of shock. Cam's eyebrows climbed to a place he didn't know they could go. Byrne's mouth opened, shut, opened. Something like pain crossed his face, then something like relief, and then the two made peace without telling anyone what their terms were.
Why me? Ishara asked, barely aware she'd said it aloud. Burns swallowed. He looked at the letter, at the logbook, at the empty signature line that had waited for his hand the way a runway waits for a certain engine sound. The debt will come find you on 2 legs and too much pride. His name is Saul Byrne. You will know what to do with him. My father, Byrne said, voice threadbare, turned down the general when he offered this, said we didn't need charity, said we'd fix the place our way. And then he died. And I did what sons do. I kept saying no to a dead man's generosity because it felt like being loyal. I never signed. He laughed, one note, a brittle thing. I never signed. Cam rubbed the back of his neck, gaze sliding anywhere but at Byrne. Arjun stared at the photograph as if the woman inside might step out and adjust his grip on the drill. Sign it now, Ishara said. Byrne looked at her, startled. Just like that? Not for me, she said. For the place. For the kid with his fingers on the bit. For the men you miss. For the general who wrote to a woman he didn't know because he trusted that somewhere, someday, one would arrive with hands like this. She held up her palms, scored, dirty, alive. Sign it so I don't have to fight wind and pride at the same time. Byrne reached for a pen but then stopped. Cam? Don't look at me, Cam said, but his voice lacked its ordinary calcium. He looked at Ishara, then at the photograph, then at the endowment. Hell, he said softly, hell. He nodded once. Sign it, Saul. Byrne bent and wrote his name. His hand shook exactly as long as it took to make the S. When he lifted the pen, the air felt different. Thinner, cleaner. Like a room after a storm when the power returns and the refrigerator sounds like a choir. No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was the kind where quiet saves more lives than applause. What's in Bay 2? Arjun whispered. They all turned their heads as if the hangar could answer, as if steel and shade could say, this way. Ishara tucked the envelopes back into the box and carried it like you carry your grandmother's last cake pan. They crossed the shop with purpose, feet sounding a new rhythm on the concrete. Bay 2 had been welded shut sometime between the moon landing and the invention of email. The seam ran a firm, merciless line. Cam fetched a grinder. Sparks rose, and the door coughed rust as if clearing its throat before the first line of a hymn. Moment of truth, Ishara murmured, more to the building than the men. She fit both hands to the handle and pulled. The door moved 3 inches, then 6, then a foot. Dust slid from the top beam in a soft avalanche, a century surrendering. Light speared in and revealed a shape at once impossible and inevitable. Canvas wrapped, long and patient. The smell that came out was old oil and dope and time. Ishara's knees went weak and found faith in the floor. The canvas had stencils, US 11B. Someone had drawn a smiley face on one corner in grease pencil, an ancient joke squinting into the present. Arjun made a sound that was not language. Cam swore, then whispered sorry to someone who wasn't there to care. Burns' hand rose to his mouth and stayed there. They cut the laces. They peeled back the canvas like dawn. Underneath stood an airframe that had once gone to war and come back with its bones singing. Its aluminum was dull where it should shine. Its tires softened to tired, but its lines were true. The serial number on its tail matched the tag in the box. Piper L4 Grasshopper. Spotter. Flew low and slow and brave. There was a note tied to the control stick with sisal twine. The paper had outlived impatience. It said, "If you are reading this, you are either a thief or the future. Either way, please put air in my lungs." The laugh that broke out of Ishara came from somewhere near her ribs. The kind work makes when it recognizes its own face in a mirror. She touched the stick like a hello. Her hands shook. She did not apologize. They stood there, 3 men and a boy and a woman, feeling time fold around them like a map put away carefully. Arjun took out his phone and then thought better of it and put it back, as if pictures might steal something from the moment. "We'll need fabric," Cam said, surprisingly practical. "Dope, maybe new spars. She might have dry rot in the ailerons." He looked enchanted, the smirk gone. "Damn Vale." "Damn Vale," Arjun echoed reverently. Byrne found a light switch he hadn't used in his adult life and flipped it. The bulb above the bay door considered its options, then came on. Dust lifted like a congregation standing. "Town's gonna hear about this by dinner. They can come look. They can come help. They can bring coffee. They can bring their mockery and watch me turn it into wings." Cam chuckled. "You gonna make me sentimental?" "No," she said, eyes on the airplane, fingers tracing rivets like a rosary. "I'm going to make you useful."
They threw the door wide, and the afternoon laid itself across the floor. Beyond the runway and the fence and the seated mountains, a storm was gathering up its skirts in the west, blue-black with electricity. The air had that taste it gets before lightning, metal and promise. At 4 o'clock sharp, the first pickup rolled in with a family wearing curiosity. At 4:30, the diner sent coffee by accident. At 5, May Hardy marched up with a cake she pretended to have baked for a sister. At 5:15, the high school shop teacher wandered over to check on the kids and happened to have a box of AN hardware in his trunk. By sunset, Hangar 9 sounded like a barn raising written by aviation and powered by contrition. The laughter that rose now had a different timbre, the kind that comes from seeing your own cynicism lose a fair fight. Byrne stood with his hat off and his pen useless. Cam stood with grease on his forearm and didn't mind. Ishara kept her hands moving and her ears open. She heard apologies that never said the word, compliments disguised as advice, offers of help disguised as warnings. She translated everything into the currency of work. She made a list on the whiteboard that had arrived as if it had always been here. Fabric, spars, bearings, fluids, trust. When the last folks drifted home with moonlight snagged on their bumper stickers, she locked Bay 2 and leaned her forehead against the cool door. The hangar hummed the way a thing hums when you've given it a reason. Arjun came to her side, awkward with the enormity of what had just happened. "Miss Vale? You think the general knew it'd be you?" "No, I think he knew it'd be someone who wouldn't flinch." She considered, then added, and that it'd hurt, and we'd do it anyway. He nodded as if pain and doing it anyway were secrets he could carry without dropping. He went home on his bike, tail light bright as faith. She swept, she listened, the night came in polite and sat down. The next morning, before the sky had decided whether to be blue or the color of worry, a convoy turned off the highway and rolled down the dirt road toward Hangar 9. Not pickups with local gust on their tires, black SUVs, 3 of them, windows the color of secrets. They moved like an answer to a question nobody had permission to ask. Ishara stepped out into the soft new light, grease on her fingers, sleep caught in the bend of her elbows. Byrne appeared from his office, hair flattened on one side like he'd lost a fight with a pillow. Cam materialized with a wrench in his hand the way some men pick up baseball bats when a shadow moves. The SUVs fanned out and stopped as one. The driver door of the first opened. A woman stepped out in a suit that made no sound and shoes that didn't need permission. She held a leather folio and a look that had never bothered to learn uncertainty. Her hair didn't move because even the wind knew this was not its moment. "I'm looking for the owner of Hangar 9, she said, voice smooth as a contract written by a pen that never runs out. Ishara didn't have to answer. The woman already knew. Her gaze settled on Ishara the way a lens settles on focus. "My name is Karen Colby. I represent the estate of General Gideon Parrish." She tilted her head, a gesture that could be condolence in a different world. "I believe you have something that belongs to us." Behind her, 2 men in suits opened the rear of the second SUV. They did it carefully, like you carry a cake you can't cut wrong. Inside sat an aluminum case stenciled with a number that matched the one on the L4's tail. The woman waited. Ishara said nothing. Some silences are hammers, some are scalpels. This one was a key. Colby smiled like someone who enjoys puzzles even when they realize they've been misinformed. "And," she added, turning her folio so the morning could see it, "we have something that belongs to you." She slipped out a document with a crest pressed into the top margin, a compass rose with its north smooth from use. Arjun, late and breathless, skidded to a stop on his bike, eyes huge. Cam swore under his breath, soft enough that only the runway heard. Byrne's hand found his hat and then forgot what it usually did. Colby looked from the paper to the bay door to the people. She said, "The general left one last instruction. It was not in the public will. It was a letter to be delivered only if this hangar woke up." "Woke up," Ishara repeated, tasting the words and liking the way they fit the morning. Colby nodded. "He drafted it 8 years ago and added a postscript last winter. It concerns this airframe, this endowment, and the conditions under which the Air Force Museum would be asked to stand down." She paused. "And it names you." Wind pulled a line across the runway. Metal somewhere settled with a tick. A hawk carved a quiet V in the sky and pretended not to watch history take a breath. Colby snapped the folio shut and met Ishara's eyes with a steadiness that said, "I've read enough last letters to know when one is about to burn a town clean." "Shall we go inside?" she asked pleasantly. "Because either we make a deal today," her smile sharpened, "or I call the Marshal's service."
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Colby's question hung between the SUVs and the yawning mouth of Hangar 9. Shall we go inside? Because either we make a deal today, or I call the Marshal's service. No one moved. The wind made one dry pass over the runway and sat down again like a dog that knows when not to bark. Ishara Vale felt the weight of every gaze. The commissioners, the mechanics, the boys touch her shoulders and wait to see if she would bend. She didn't. She nodded once and palmed the cool edge of Bay 2's door. "Inside," she said. They filed into the cathedral of corrugated light. The L4 waited under its canvas like a good secret.
The tin box with the compass rose seal rested on the bench where she'd left it, the general's first letter folded back into itself like something that did not wish to be worshipped, only obeyed. Dust made its quiet planets in the shafts of sun. If justice has a sound, Ishara thought, it is the sound a big quiet room makes when men set down their weapons and listen with their hands. Colby did not sit. She didn't seem like someone who ever sat until she'd gotten what paperwork promised her. The two men in suits flanked her a respectful step back, their faces arranged in neutral. "Let's not spend more words than necessary," she said, opening the folio and laying out a sheaf of documents between an oil can and a rivet bucking bar. General Parrish placed Hangar 9 into a trust with a sequence of instructions publicly filed, you've seen some of it, airport commission authorization, a local endowment for restoration, etc. Privately, he wrote 3 letters, one to his attorney of record, one to me as executor, and one to, her gaze flicked to Ishara, steady, measuring, to the woman who would wake the hangar. Arjun's breath caught like a bird in a net. Cam shifted his weight unconsciously until his boots remembered balance. Byrne took off his hat and rubbed the line it had left on his forehead, as if erasing an old habit would make room for a new duty. Colby placed a sealed envelope on the bench. It bore the compass rose again, north smooth from thumb. "For you," she said. "I'm not authorized to read it. If, after you've read it, you can meet the conditions it contains, we will stand down all claims of immediate custody by the Air Force Museum System and the Department of the Air Force. If you can't, the museum convoy will be here at 1400 to load the aircraft and certain archival items into those trucks." She inclined her head toward the waiting SUVs. "With or without your consent." "Those aren't museum trucks," Cam murmured. "They are what the museum uses when it can't risk damage on an open trailer." She waited. "Miss Vale." Ishara looked at the envelope, at the L4, at the boy with his jaw set like a new bolt torqued to spec. She broke the red wax with her thumbnail. This time the sound was an intake of breath. She unfolded the paper and let the general step into the room again. "To the woman with grease in her lifelines. By now, the building will have tested you. Good. Wind should never trust a roof that doesn't argue back. If you have found the L4, you will call her Cricket before this is done. Men always insist on names with weight, but airplanes prefer small music. Then you have also found the endowment and discovered whether Saul has learned the difference between pride and loyalty. If he has not, educate him. If he has, trust him with the pen. Here are my conditions for the future of this hangar and this airframe. 1. The aircraft will be restored in place and will fly from this runway under a day whose light belongs to this county. It will not be trucked to a museum unless you are dead, foolish, or dishonest. I suspect you are none of these. 2. The restoration will be a school. Take on apprentices who have no last names that open doors. Teach them to safety wire more honestly than they have ever spoken. If you can teach a young man or woman to trust a torque wrench, you can teach them to trust themselves. Before first flight, the crew will read aloud the names of the dead for whom this aircraft worked. Observers, radio men, kids who carried message bags in boots 2 sizes too big. If the world insists it can only be moved by jets, remind it that wars were once won by the slow and the brave. When the airplane flies, the first ride, after the test hop, will go to a veteran who has never been thanked properly. I leave the choice to you. If Sal balks, tell him I knew his father. That will buy you exactly 7 minutes. Last, the letter you are reading will be read publicly to those who mocked you, to those who doubted you, and to those who helped you anyway. Not to humiliate them, to silence the wrong laughter and give the right laughter back its job. If this is not possible, call the number at the bottom of this page and tell Miss Colby to do the unkind thing kindly. But I did not build a life in the air to end it in a glass box. Every runway is a question. Answer well. Gideon Parrish. P.S. Open the crate in the SUV. I kept a few spares that the war forgot to reclaim. The paper trembled in Ishara's hands. Colby watched her face with the interest of a surgeon studying a heart that had remembered how to beat. Byrne closed his eyes briefly at the line about his father. When he opened them, he looked at the floor like it might absolve him if he stood on it long enough. "What's the number?" Cam asked. "Not one you're going to dial," Ishara said, and she felt something solid slide into place inside her, like a main spar finding its seat.
Colby inclined her head the slightest degree, acknowledgement of a decision made by a person she was prepared to defer to. "The conditions?" she asked. "We accept," Ishara said. "All of them." She glanced at Byrne. "Mr. Commissioner?" Byrne swallowed. "You have my signature and my word. We'll convene the commission today to ratify and minute it." "That will satisfy us," Colby said, and for the first time her voice softened. General Parrish did not choose his words lightly, or his people carelessly. She exhaled, and in that single breath, the adversary in her stepped aside to let a witness stand. "For what it's worth, he asked me 8 years ago to find the woman who would do this work and not get in her way once I did." "Then why the Marshal's service?" Command demanded, bristling on principle. "Because law is the harness you put on power to keep it from stepping on your reputation," Colby said mildly. "And because some counties," she looked around the hangar without disdain, "confuse tradition with obstruction and then call it care." The boy laughed, a small, surprised bark, and clapped a hand over his mouth, embarrassed. Colby smiled once at him and then became business again. "May we open the crate?" They wheeled the aluminum case onto the concrete and popped the latches. Inside lay a trove from a decade that still smelled like courage. New old-stock magnetos wrapped in waxed paper, a set of pistons and cosmoline, an AN hardware kit organized into an order that made Cam whistle low. There were rolls of Irish linen for fabric, carefully bagged and labeled, and a cylinder baffling that must have been purchased from some depot sale 90 lifetimes ago. "Does the museum still object?" Byrne asked, not quite challenging, not quite pleading. Colby lifted out a wrapped bundle and set it on the bench. She peeled back the paper and revealed a brass placard, already engraved, "The Parish Wing, restored by the hands of Bighorn County. We object to neglect and to ego. General Parrish anticipated both." She nodded at the letter in Ishara's hand. "Read it publicly, Miss Vale. That will take care of the rest." They began the work the way you begin a long repentance, slowly, with lists, with rituals. There was no montage to save them the labor. Days were plumbed in sweat and measured in safety wire twists. The teenagers learned to speak torque in inch pounds and humility in thousandths. Arjun wrote figures on his forearm with a Sharpie until he learned to hold them in his head. Ishara set the tone and the tolerances and discovered that command sat easily on her shoulders when it was only another word for stewardship. Cam kept showing up. At first he came to correct, the way a man accustomed to authority brings his sentences sharpened. It took 3 afternoons for him to stop phrasing his contributions like rescues and start phrasing them like questions. On the 4th, he apologized to the airplane when his elbow slipped and he knocked a wrench against her rib. "Did you just tell a wing, I'm sorry?" May Hardy asked from the doorway, amusement tucked into her mouth. "Better to apologize to a wing than to a coffin because you didn't." May nodded once, approval earned, and therefore worth double. She came every day thereafter, with thermoses and gossip scavenged for bolts of kindness. Byrne, true to his word, convened the commission. He read the general's letter aloud in the stuffy little room with the flag and the bad coffee, and when he finished, no one moved for a breath that lasted 2. Then they voted, unanimous, and in the space of a gavel tap, a county changed shape around a woman with a wrench. Colby left on the 2nd day, after the plaque was mounted above the office door and the teenagers had gotten the hang of rib stitching. She shook Ishara's hand like equals and told Arjun, "If she kicks you out for talking too much, come to law school. We like that problem." He blushed in a way that would become a story he told later with bravado. Work taught them each other's edges. Ishara learned that Cam counted twice,
and then still distrusted the number. So she made him call out his measurements to Arjun, who learned to be a mirror that didn't lie. She learned that May's sarcasm was the armor a woman builds after 50 years of talking to men who underestimate. Beneath it beat an engine that idled kind. She learned that Byrne, when left alone, would pick up a broom and make the floor say what it had seen. The town learned too. Men who laughed came to hold ladders. Women who smiled politely came to bring ledgers and make sure the receipts told the same story the hands did. Old veterans stood at the door and didn't cross the threshold until someone asked. And when asked, they stepped into the light like boys. "Name," Ishara asked each. "Frank. Observer, France. We flew nap of the earth so low I could smell the mustard fields. I've been waiting 60 years to hear that engine cough good again." "Name," she asked another.
"Lydia," she said, eyes sharp as stitches. "Home front, fabric shop. My husband threaded a needle in 44 and said it felt like a prayer." "Name?" "Doc," said a third, and everyone laughed because he had been Doc since before some of them were born. "You know me." "I know your hands," she said, and he looked at his hands and looked away, surprised to find himself seen. It wasn't glamorous. Fabric stank. Dope made their heads swim and their jokes turned goofy if the fans lagged. Safety wire bit blood from careless fingers. They made mistakes and unmade them and learned where apology belongs, first to the work, then to each other. Some evenings, Ishara sat on the office steps and put her forehead on her knees and breathed like you breathe when grief sees you with your guard down and tries to remarry you. On those nights, the general's letter lay on the desk with a stone on it, an old habit from field camps to hold down maps when the wind is bigger than belief. She'd read the line about laughter again and feel the sting of old mockery recede like a tide that had remembered the moon. And then she'd get up and go check the linen tautness one more time, because trust is a muscle you build by keeping promises the world can't see. The day the engine went back together, the shop went quiet as a church where the preacher has asked for the amens to be saved for later. Cam laid the pistons in like a man putting the first birthday candles into a cake for a child he thought he didn't want. Arjun gapped plugs with a solemnity that had no teenage irony on it. Ishara torqued the head nuts until each one said the same thing back to her hand. "Moment of truth," Cam said, and the phrase did not sound like a threat anymore. They wheeled Cricket, she had become Cricket without anyone voting, into the mouth of the hangar. The runway lay outstretched like a question that didn't mind being asked again and again. Clouds loped high and lazy. The wind remembered its manners. "Ready?" Ishara asked. Arjun swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Cam. He nodded, and there was a shine in his eyes he'd blame on the dope if anyone teased him. No one would. "Fuel on, mixture rich, throttle cracked a whisper, magnetos hot, prime, prop." Ishara took the propeller in both hands and felt the weight of every morning that had ever answered to this motion. She pulled it through. The first cough was the kind that makes a room of men go still. The second was the kind that makes a boy believe. On the third, the little engine found itself and ran. Sound leapt from the cylinders and wrapped the hangar in a note so clean the dust seemed to harmonize. Old men who had held their breath forgot they were old. May put her hand over her mouth and didn't bother to hide the wet at the edges of her eyes. Byrne took off his hat and didn't put it back on. Arjun whooped, and the whoop broke into a laugh that broke into something else, and he wiped his face as if oil had splashed him. Ishara closed her eyes and listened with her sternum, with the bones that had always loved the vocabulary of combustion. She checked pressures and temps, leaned just so, eased the throttle, and the engine answered like a practiced partner. They learned each other in 3 minutes, would take some couples a decade. "Taxi?" Cam asked, barely daring. "Taxi," Ishara said. They eased her out. The tailwheel complained about a tension after so many years of being ignored. The mains rolled like someone's grandfather's shoulders learning joy again. Cricket tracked straight once the steering found its story. At the end of the runway, they paused.
The wind brushed their cheeks with 2 fingers. The county was laid out like a map of debts paid and promises due. "Not today," Ishara said. "Today she learns the ground again. Tomorrow we let her forget it." They turned back, and the hangar accepted its prodigal with an indulgence that made every teenager in the room think secretly about coming home after a mistake and being hugged anyway. Legalities followed the way thunder follows heat. Colby returned with a museum liaison and a stack of papers that had to be witnessed and filed and stamped by people who still wondered out loud whether a woman could be trusted with wings. Ishara read every line. When something felt off, she didn't raise her voice. She raised her eyebrow, and words rearranged themselves to survive.
The liaison, a thin man with the permanent expression of someone who remembers being shushed in libraries, objected to the public reading of the general's letter. "It is irregular," he said, as if the word itself might arrest them. "So is a runway in a town like this," Byrne replied. "That never stopped a pilot." He surprised himself with the ease of the defense. Pride and loyalty had finally changed places inside him and agreed to share a bed. Colby sided with Ishara. "The condition is explicit. Read it, and read it where the mocking was loudest." Her eyes flicked to Cam without malice. "Where was that?" Cam winced. "The diner." "Then the diner," Ishara said. They packed the place until coffee stained the tabletops like maps, and forks drummed the rhythms of impatience. Men who had laughed the loudest took the back wall and pretended to be there by accident. Women took front tables and sharpened their attention to a point. The teenagers filed in clean shirts that smelled valorously of dope anyway. Doc presided with his stethoscope slung like a priest's stole. Ishara stood with the letter on the counter, where the napkin holder had always been. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize the words. She let them be as plain as a wrench. When she came to the line about laughter, there was a noise in the room like something heavy being set down. Cam closed his eyes. May let her sarcasm off for the afternoon, and it wandered away smiling. Byrne folded his hands around his hat and looked smaller and truer than he had since the first day he'd taken his oath. Colby sided with Ishara. "The condition is explicit. Read it, and read it where the mocking was loudest." Her eyes flicked to Cam without malice. "Where was that?" Cam winced. "The diner." "Then the diner," Ishara said. They packed the place until coffee stained the tabletops like maps, and forks drummed rhythms of impatience. Men who had laughed the loudest took the back wall and pretended to be there by accident. Women took front tables and sharpened their attention to a point. The teenagers filed in clean shirts that smelled valorously of dope anyway. Doc presided with his stethoscope slung like a priest's stole. Ishara stood with the letter on the counter, where the napkin holder had always been. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize the words. She let them be as plain as a wrench. When she came to the line about laughter, there was a noise in the room like something heavy being set down. Cam closed his eyes. May let her sarcasm off for the afternoon, and it wandered away smiling. Byrne folded his hands around his hat and looked smaller and truer than he had since the first day he'd taken his oath. Colby stood at the back with the museum liaison, who fidgeted with a sugar packet until it had no structural integrity. When Ishara finished, she did not ask for anything. She simply set the letter down next to the napkin holder and waited. Silence held its breath. Then someone near the grill clapped once, tentative. Another answered. A third turned the heat up. In a heartbeat, the room joined hands in a noise that was not apology, that is too easy a currency, but consent. Consent that this would be their story. Consent that the joke had been on fear, not the woman with the wrench. Cam stepped forward and put both hands on the counter. His voice wanted to be brave and almost managed it. "I said a lot of stupid things," he began, but Ishara raised a hand. "You held the grinder. That's a better sentence." May barked a laugh.
The room exhaled the way a field exhales after rain when it sees the fence is still there. The day before first flight, the air went bright and the sky taut. The kind of weather that makes every sound sound closer. They wheeled Cricket out at dawn for engine run and controls check. The names, 32 of them, were written in careful hand on a board that Arjun had built, varnished, and sanded until the wood felt like agreement. At noon, a storm line stood up on the western horizon like a jury. They would have a window, and then they would not. "Today or a week," Cam said. "Today," Ishara answered. Runways are questions. Storms are answers with deadlines. Colby appeared in a truck this time, not an SUV. Hair pulled back like someone who remembered that the law also has hands. She carried a small box. "From the general," she said, handing it to Ishara. Inside lay a pair of goggles, leather cracked and lens clouded with the history of wind. On the strap he had written with hard soldier humor, "For when you forget which way tears fall." "Who flies?" the museum liaison asked, trying not to make it sound like an indictment. "It test top goes to the person who put her bones back together," Ishara said. "The first ride goes to a veteran who has never been thanked properly." She looked at Duck, whose eyes widened and then filled, rebelled by their clarity. "I am not," he began. "You are," she said, "for every boy you tended who never learned how to breathe the rest of his life." He swallowed, his hands shook, he nodded. Byrne read the names. He had laid his politician's voice down somewhere and left it. He read like a man paying a debt he had finally decided not to resent. When he finished, the wind changed direction. Not superstition. Flags tell truths. Ishara strapped in. Cam checked the tail wires and patted the fabric as if the airplane could feel approval. Arjun put his palm on the metal tag on the tail and whispered something that sounded like a promise to his future self. Engine alive, taxi true, run up good. She eased Cricket onto the runway and felt the little ship vibrate with an eagerness that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with memory. At the far end, she turned, held the brakes, breathed once like a swimmer, and rolled. Torque tugged, tail came up. The runway released its grip with a small, surprised, "Ah!" Air caught and kept. Wheels forgot what they were for. The ground moved away politely. For 6 long seconds, she did not blink. 6 seconds is a lifetime when a machine remembers itself. Controls lived. The horizon settled where it should. She let Cricket rise no higher than the hangar roof, and then with a gentleness that would have made a different audience sigh, she settled her back onto the runway. A skip, a kiss, a promise. Not a flight so much as a vow tested and not found wanting. The field erupted. People who had never cared about airplanes yelled like their team had finally forgiven them for doubting them. Doc dropped his face into his hands and laughed into his palms like a man who had remembered both births he had caught and deaths he had failed to bribe. Ishara taxied back, turned and shut down. Silence reached out and shook hands with sound. She climbed out, pulled off the goggles and wiped her cheeks without shame. "The test is good," she said simply. "We fly." They refueled. They checked what men forget to check when they believe too early. Ishara helped Doc into the front seat. He touched everything with reverence that did not feel like worship, but like old friendship renewed after a fight. "Ready?" Ishara asked.
"I've been ready since 1944, he said softly. They rolled, they rose. The field dropped away and became map. The town rearranged itself into a child's drawing, a square for the diner, a stick for the flagpole, a ribbon for the river. The storm on the horizon lifted a temp to show lightning in the hills and then remembered its manners and hid its knees. Ishara kept them low, wide of the far pasture where the Pratts put up barbed wire too close to the wind. She felt Doc's shoulders unspool in the seat in front of her. She watched the little altimeter lie and tell the truth by turns. "Thank you," he said into the slipstream.
It was not for the ride alone. They circled once over the Legion Hall. Men spilled out and waved like they were flagging down their younger selves. They circled once over the cemetery on the hill. The wind did something there that made the hairs on her arms stand up and then lie down again, as if it had just made two opposite decisions and been right both times. On final approach, the storm coughed a warning 4 ridges away. Ishara brought Cricket down with a firmness that convinced the airplane the ground was a friend again, not a rival. The rollout was short. The applause would have been louder if Awe hadn't put its hand over Joy's mouth. When the prop ticked to silence, the first person of the wing was Byrne. He did not make a speech. He put his hand flat on the fabric and bowed his head like a man at a rail. Cam embraced Arjun without warning and then stepped back, embarrassed by his own body's honesty. Arjun didn't let him get away with it. He hugged him back harder. Colby approached with the museum liaison in tow. The man's eyes were wet and furious at their betrayal. Colby said nothing, which is sometimes the most generous advocacy the law can offer. "Speech," May called, but there was no mockery left in her, only command given to the right general. Ishara stood on the step and held the general's letter. "I don't have new words," she said, "just his." She read the last paragraph again. "Every runway is a question. Answer well." She folded it and tucked it under the strap of the old goggles where anyone who came after could find it when they needed to remember which way tears fall. The first drops of rain came in big comic circles. People laughed and held out their palms like kids. Someone started wheeling Cricket in. Hands appeared as if the airplane had grown a dozen extra, all wanting to help, all careful. They had her halfway to the door when 3 more black SUVs turned off the highway and lined up like ellipses at the end of a sentence you don't want to finish. Colby's jaw tensed. She moved toward them, already building a sentence that would hold in crosswind. The museum liaison went gray, then recovered his bureaucrat's tan and squared himself for battle. The center SUV door opened. A man in a blue windbreaker with a badge stepped out, looked at the crowd, looked at the airplane, and then, almost sheepishly, looked at the sky. "Ms. Vale," he called. Rain doubted his cheeks like stubble. "I'm Deputy Marshal Lister. We've had conflicting orders." "You're in luck," Ishara said, and now her voice carried like a runway light when the weather goes indecisive. "We have clarity." She lifted the letter. General Parrish left his last words, and the law, she nodded toward Colby, brought them. She walked toward Lister, rain stitching dashes across the interval between them. She handed him the letter. Lister read the first lines, then the last, lips moving the way a man's do when he knows his job is not to interpret, but to deliver. He looked up at the airplane, at the crowd, at the storm, at the runway which had just turned the color of new chance. "Ma'am," he said, "I was told to secure federal property." He gestured with the envelope. "This tells me to secure the conditions under which the federal government promised to do the decent thing. I prefer that order." He raised his voice, addressing the deputies, the liaison, the town. "We stand down." You can measure a community's moral temperature by how it receives good authority. Bighorn County cheered like a pressure relief valve, opening after years of a line overpressured by nothing but habit. Cam whooped like the teenage boy he'd been before he learned to pronounce ridicule. May cried and cussed in the same sentence and decided not to apologize for either. Byrne put his hand over his heart in a gesture so naked that if anyone had laughed, they would have been escorted outside by a dozen women and told to consider their choices. The rain turned earnest. They pushed Cricket into the hangar under a chorus of instructions that were all the right kind. Watch your fingers, mind the hinge, don't scratch her, easy now. The door shut on the storm like a book closing gently on a page that had not quite dried. Inside, the sound was rain on a big roof, and breathing, and laughter that had learned its job again. Doc shook Deputy Lister's hand as colleagues who had remembered the first principle: do no harm to the truth. The museum liaison asked in a small voice whether he could take a picture. Ishara said yes without making him trade for it. Doc sat on a crate and cried the way old men do when they don't need privacy anymore. Arjun handed him a shop rag, as if he were handing him a medal. Byrne took the rag back and gave Doc a clean one, because some respect is practical. Byrne wandered to the office and stood under the new plaque, reading it as if words could chisel him into a man he would not mind being when he was quiet. He reached up and touched the brass, not like a switch, but like a headstone. "Thank you," he whispered, to someone who had written him into a letter and therefore into a future.
Ishara leaned against the door jamb of Bay 2 and let the rain do its old work of washing men the way mountains are washed. Slow, firm, patient. She thought of the first day and Cam on the fence and the laughter that had wanted her to set the wrench down and go learn to be appropriately small elsewhere. She thought of the boy with the Sharpie notes on his arm and the old men with silence lodged in the back of their throats, finally coughing it up without blood. She thought of General Parrish and his compass rose with north worn smooth from fingers that had known which way to go, even when maps were wrong. "Miss Vale," a voice said softly at her shoulder. She turned. Colby stood with her a step inside the doorway, suit damp at the hem, hair finally admitting to the weather. For the first time, the woman looked a little tired and therefore available to understanding. "You did it," Colby said. "We did it," Ishara corrected. "We." She gestured at the room, the boy, the veterans, the commissioner, the mechanic who had stopped needing to be right in order to be good. "He wrote the letter. We read it out loud. That's all." Colby nodded, a smile more private than the others. For what it's worth, the general would have liked that sentence. She hesitated. "And there is one more box in the truck." "More spares?" Cam blurted, materializing with an almost comic timing that made May snort. Colby shook her head. "A logbook. His." She held Ishara's gaze. "He wanted it kept here. Said honor wears out slower than metal if you keep using it." Ishara felt her eyes do what eyes do when the word trust arrives carrying its luggage. "We'll keep using it. Until the hinges learn our names." The rain softened to a memories version of itself. Someone made coffee and sweetened it irresponsibly. Laughter, the right kind, the kind that rests its hand on the back of work without interrupting it, found its chair. Arjun took a picture only when the airplane asked for it by looking particularly photogenic at the angle where the patched fabric caught the light like a healed place. At dusk, the storm blew itself out east and left the runway smoking in the low sun like a long black ribbon you could gift wrap a second chance with. The town trickled away to chores, to suppers, to phone calls that began with, "You should have seen," and ended with, "I know, me too." Ishara locked the doors and stood with her hand on the cool of the metal a beat longer than necessary. The compass rose on the office floor gleamed with the kind of shine only knees and decisions can give. The general's letter lay under its stone. The goggles hung from a nail where a tired mechanic could reach them and remember which way tears fall when work has told them to stop pretending they don't. Cam lingered in the doorway, sheepish with the gratitude too big for his pockets. "You're not going to make me say it, are you? You've been saying it all week. With your hands." He nodded. "I'm better with those." He started to go and then stopped. "Hey, Vale." "Yeah?" "Are you going to keep her here? I mean, after? When people come through?" "She's a school, not a trophy." He grinned. "Good." He let the grin turn shy. "And if you ever need—" "I'll ask," she said, saving him from the clumsiness of generosity spoiled by words. When everyone else had gone, Byrne returned alone. He stood at the edge of the office and waited to be invited.
Ishara waved him in. He removed his hat, even though the room needed no respect that required a hat to be removed. "My father," he said without preamble, "would have hated this." "Probably. And then he would have come anyway, and stood where you're standing and pretended to supervise." Burns' laugh brought a picture of a young man who had never made a policy because he was too busy lifting things. "He was wrong about a lot. I let that harden into creed. I picked up the general's logbook and didn't open it. May I? You're the steward, not the owner. That's a better job." He opened it, and the first entry was in a tight hand that did not waste curves. "Take off. Kimpo. 0530. The word return appeared in the margin with a check mark that was a prayer answered by a pencil. Byrne read for a while, and then set the book down with care. "Thank you," he said. "For more than paper." "For signing," she said. "Twice." He smiled, and she realized he'd become easier to look at since he'd decided what sort of man to be in rooms without applause. "Good night, Miss Vale." "Good night, Mr. Commissioner." When he had gone, when even the rain had run out of ways to be helpful, Ishara walked to Cricket's nose and put her palm against the spinner. Metal kept the day's heat like a memory you can re-warm on purpose. She closed her eyes. Behind them, scenes from the last weeks unspieled without the need for edits. The boy with his sharp yarn, the woman reading names in a diner where jokes had once been cheaper than truth, the man with a badge choosing the kinder order, the lawyer in a suit letting someone else finish the sentence. "You and me. Tomorrow we start teaching." She whispered to the airplane, to the building, to the compass rose under her boots. A moth bumped the office window and moved on, disappointed by a light it couldn't own. Somewhere a coyote made its ridiculous case for darkness. The hangar settled the way big rooms settle when their purpose stops rattling and fits. Outside, the runway lay dark and patient, its question asked and asked again. Inside, the letter lay on the desk with its stone, and beside it someone had left a note in a boy's handwriting that made her smile even before she read it. "Thank you for letting me touch the sky before I knew how." She turned off the lights, and the building didn't mind. Some places don't need illumination to remember who they are. In the darkness, Ishara locked the door and listened, just to be sure, for laughter. She heard it. The right kind. The kind that belongs to people who have let their pride resign and their loyalty get promoted. It rose from the far end of the runway where the town had gone home and become better by increments that never make the paper. She slipped the goggles over a nail and went out into the night that smelled like wet sage and beginnings. 2 weeks later, the county fair set up its carousel of sugar and boasting across the highway. Hangar 9 opened its doors to the kind of traffic the runway didn't mind. Children's hands learned to touch nothing unless invited. Veterans taught strangers how to listen for an engine's small honesty. Colby sent a postcard with nothing on it but a compass rose and the words, "Keep using it." Cam delivered a box of safety wire and, without comment, a cake he claimed he hadn't baked. May ate 2 slices and claimed she hated both. On the last night of the fair, while fireworks rehearsed their imitation of war across the river, Ishara stood in Bay 2 and felt the concussions shake the roof gently. Cricket didn't flinch. The old goggles on the nail looked toward the noise and didn't cloud. The letter under the stone rested like a heart between beats. She smiled into the dark and spoke out loud, not to the past,
but to the people who would keep arriving with laughter and doubt and hands. "Welcome," she said softly. "Pick up a wrench." And far off, beyond the county line, where the highway remembers how to be straight, a woman she would someday teach tightened her grip on a steering wheel and felt, for no reason she could name, suddenly brave.